Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome all of you to the annual Weavenson Lecture. And for those of you that have been in here waiting, perhaps you've had an opportunity to look at the PowerPoint a little bit. I want to thank Ashley Griswold for putting this together. She worked along with Abigail Weavenson to put together a great tribute, I think, to John. The Weavenson Lecture is, like all of the lectures in our lecture series, is an endowed lecture. And as the Weavenson family and friends of John Weavenson got together to decide on how to best honor John, they thought that a lecture series that focused on socially relevant architecture was particularly important, because that was really Weeb's life work. John Weavenson, as you may have gleaned from the information in the PowerPoint, was a faculty member here in the School of Architecture and was an inspiration to everyone who knew him. Just as I was coming on as a faculty member some 27 years ago, I remember John was still a fixture here in the school, would come out to reviews and would really sort of animate things in the classroom and in project reviews, and I was glad to have the opportunity to get to know him. He spent his life doing what he loved most, which was making a difference in his community by practicing what he called architecture with a social purpose. It's very important, I think, to understand, is that architecture, I think tonight's lecturer will certainly underscore that. Weeb was a people's advocate, and whether it was his late work in the 1960s with Resurrection City, or helping to save a historic and wonderful place like the old post office building in Washington, D.C., or making the coolest maps in the city, or inspiring us to do the right thing with good spirit and cheer. He was a great man and certainly a great legacy of the early generation of this school. John touched all who knew him and imparted his way of seeing on generations of students, colleagues, and importantly, his clients, the people. And so I think that's really what the message is that, of the Weavenson Lecture Series, is a way to perpetuate this idea that John brought that made him unique among his peers on the faculty. This evening, we have the honor of having Abigail Weavenson, John's wife, here with us tonight, and principal donor in the series.
Hi, everybody.
And his partner in architectural practice, Kendall Dorman, who was with John right up into the end in his practice. So wonderful to have you here as well tonight. In keeping with the theme of this series, several years ago, or actually 2 years ago, I had the opportunity at an administrators conference to hear an extraordinary presentation by Michael Murphy, talking about the work of Mass Design Group and talking about the extraordinary quality and relevancy of design in a context that is constantly challenged by relevancy, that is architecture. The practice of architecture seems to drift off in various ways to amuse itself. But what Michael Murphy's message brought to this conference of architectural educators was about an architecture that was truly relevant and an architecture that was truly informative of today. It was also very inventive architecture. That is that the kind of practice that mass design engages in really advocates a new model for practice. And it may not be a model that's relevant for everyone, but it certainly challenges the traditional models of practice that your card-carrying AIA or FAIA member might simply narrow their view of what practice is about. These folks have really challenged the way to make a living for themselves and to do well for others at the same time. And I think that's was really extraordinary in the message. On top of it all, they do extraordinary buildings. Buildings that any one of us would be proud to put our names to. So this evening, I think it's wonderful that we have the opportunity to welcome Ciara Bainbridge. And Ciara is a senior director with the Mass Design Group. She's at the partner level with that particular group. Ciara began her work in 2008, focusing on landscape architecture, and joined full-time in 2009 to finalize the design and oversee the implementation of Butaro Hospital, Mass Design's first project. So I think this will be an interesting opportunity to see somebody that was really there at the ground level, well, not to make a pun in terms of landscape architecture, at the ground level in the inception of this firm. She currently directs the ongoing design and implementation of Mass's planning and architectural projects, and is currently overseeing the Kayana Center, an academic facility supporting rural health care delivery and research in Uganda, a number of African conservation schools in DRC, in Tanzania, Zambia, and Rwanda, and the Butaro Hospital expansion plan, among others. So the areas of the world that Mass Design operates is probably not the areas of the world that most boutique firms operate in, but rather they go right into the thick of things and really operate in areas that I think, personally, that we would probably stand up at the end and give the standing ovation for the work. Without any real further ado, I think it's important just to say that Ciara has spoken widely. She's been highly published in her work, and she received her Bachelor of Arts in Art degree in Architectural History from Smith College, and her Master of Landscape Architecture and Master of Architecture from University of Pennsylvania. I would like to welcome Ciara this afternoon, and very happy to have you here. A very befitting lecturer for this great series, the Wiebenson series. Ciara.
Thank you so much for having us, for having Mass, and for having me to represent Mass, and my apologies for being late. I drove down from Baltimore and got a bit turned around, so I'm here now. And I appreciate, again, you having me, and it's on this very special occasion and in honor of someone who I think shared a lot of the values that we have at Mass. It's not often I actually get to speak to a group of young architects. A lot of the speaking I've been doing lately is to other architects, USAID, at levels of implementation, where we're trying to convince them of the work that we're doing and why we're doing it and why it should be taken on at a much larger scale, especially in areas of resource constraint. So I kind of wanted to take the opportunity in talking to you, all of you, to reveal our design process and why we design the way we do and the impact that we see it having, and how we try to test that out on every project. And you know, what we're looking at now as we move forward, we're coming up on our kind of official 5 years of working. You know, how do we assess the success that we've had in trying to generate the impact that we hope to generate? So we'll see a little bit of the stories that we're looking at that hopefully kind of begin to underline that for us as we start to work. You know, this is a starting point that we often reference. It was a title in the New York Times in January 2012, and kind of speaks, I think, in our perspective, not so much that architecture is something that you shouldn't major in, but really what is the relevancy that architecture holds if we're unable to get a job in architecture once we graduate. I think it points to a little bit of what we were speaking about before, which is that, you know, people do not understand necessarily what architecture can be, and the relevancy of the work that we do and the impact that we can have across all scales, I think is something that hasn't yet been revealed, and what we're looking for and to show today is how it can be very relevant. It can be relevant here, it can be relevant in all the other places that we're working and that I'll be talking about today. We started out working on a hospital and learning to understand what that means as a first project. A hospital is an extremely complex organism. It has a lot of programs and adjacencies levels of technicality that take some time to be revealed. And in doing the research that we did, we really actually began to learn that whether architecture is relevant can have a lot to do with lives, saving lives, whether keeping people healthy or keeping them from getting sicker. And in our research, I mean, our expectation when we go to a hospital is that we're going to be healed. And we found, especially as we're looking at a design of a hospital in northern Rwanda, and looking at infection control and trying to understand that, there's a place called Ferry in South Africa, and we were specifically looking at tuberculosis control at that point, and learning about what infection control means. Small enclosed spaces can be extremely dangerous. This is Ferry. In the mid-'80s, 52 people came to visit this hospital, and when they visited, they all were infected with MDR-TB, and all of them died. And the director of the hospital was very clear in his understanding that it was the spaces in the hospital and this idea of healthy people that were coming in and sitting next to people who were not healthy, and lack of ventilation, lack of proper expanses for them to be in, actually made them sick. And our question was at that point, and beginning to understand how important this issue is, if a building can make us sick, can it also make us healthier? And indeed, I think our feeling is that a building can heal, and not just a hospital, but also if we're looking at the process from beginning, from kind of pre-design all the way through construction, training, the impact and the work that we can do with communities, there are many, many ways that a building can heal. It can heal rifts between countries. It can heal smaller issues within countries, such as some of the things that we looked at in Rwanda in terms of the genocide over time. But let's start first with the hospital. We're working in Barera district, which is in the very north of Rwanda. It's a very hilly and beautiful place. It's along the Albertine Rift, which kind of rises up and gives these line or chain of volcanoes. And this is a view from the top of the hill, very near where the hospital was built. And at the time, in that district that you saw the outline of, there were 400,000 people, and this is about 16 years out from the end of the genocide, and there were no doctors there. So anyone who wanted treatment often had to cross over Lake Barera in kind of dugout canoes. There were many stories of people giving birth because they weren't getting to the other side in time in the canoes. So it was in dire need of a hospital, and Kagame actually invited Paul Farmer, who's the head of Partners in Health, which was kind of our umbrella and our mentor organization, and what we learned most of how we operate through, asked us to come and design this hospital in the north of the country. It has 150 beds, and as you can see, it's sited on the top of this beautiful hill, which allows it to be exposed to breezes from the east. And again, this is where we actually learn everything, and how we started to think about infection control in the context of this site and this community and the needs there was really one of the main drivers, and something that we carried with us through all of our projects. And we really tried to find, in an area of resource constraint, you actually find great resourcefulness it comes to be. And so the kind of solutions that we came to were not very complicated solutions. They're innovative in a very simple way. They're looking first at how we can use natural systems and ventilation to kind of control or to reduce infection transmission. We used some very simple ideas like natural cross ventilation, which is actually much different. Most wards and almost all of the other kind of treatment areas often are falling on a double-hung hallway, so there's a central hallway, and you kind of enter each area from this central hallway, and that central hallway then, by default, often becomes a waiting area. So the very first move that we made was, let's just put the circulation to the exterior. It's an excellent climate. Most people enjoy being outside more than being inside. So we pushed everything to the exterior and also made all waiting areas on the exterior. And secondly, this very simple cross ventilation. We have prevailing winds from the east. And that actually is our redundant system. And our primary system, when we do have electricity, are these huge industrial fans in the middle of the rooms that pull all of the air up and into this upper plenum, and then they're treated by these UVGI lights on either side. And so we have multiple systems that are trying to, again, reduce infection. transmission. And so if this top should fail, we still can get the minimum number of 12 air changes per hour at most times using cross ventilation. And then this is how that looks on the outside and some of those outdoor waiting areas. And then again, looking at the landscape, and as was mentioned, I was brought on. Initially, I was looking at field operations at the time and working on the High Line. And so I started working on this pro bono with another friend, looking at how landscape would support kind of the healing conditions of the hospital. And Paul Farmer himself is a huge proponent of landscape, to the chagrin of most of the architects, because he really only wanted to talk about landscape when he came on site. But I think the idea is that, you know, having a place that is well tended, has a sense of beauty and dignity when you arrive onto the campus, I think brings great reassurance to patients who are very tentative of modern healthcare in Rwanda. A lot of people will go to healers for a long time before they will actually go to the hospital, and often it's too late. So if you go to a place that you sense is very well cared for, I think it underlines the confidence that patients will have that they also are very well cared for. You know, why did we start working in this particular area? I think sub-Saharan Africa bears 24% of the global disease burden, and yet has only 3% of the doctors. It is similarly true for architecture. This is just an interesting comparison. This is Italy, where they have 120,000 architects. I think their plethora of architects is well known. And Africa has 30,000 architects throughout the entire continent. And if you remove Egypt, Nigeria, and South Africa, actually that leaves 1,200 architects that are serving the rest of this area. And when we were in Rwanda, I think when we arrived, there were 9 to 12 architects. And actually, Commode and Christian here were 2 of our first Rwandan hires. They were the top of their class in engineering and were selected to have a scholarship to go to China and learn architecture. So anyone who was practicing was educated outside of the country. And while we were there, we actually participated in the beginning of the first architecture school in Rwanda, from which we graduated our first class about 2 years ago, and our top students are working with us now. But there was a dearth of architects, and so we were, you know, trying to fill the same brain drain that you will find in terms of doctors. People often go abroad and learn their trade and don't necessarily return. And so capacity building at all scales, from workmanship, craft, trades, all the way through architecture and engineering, is something that we've had to take on for all of our projects. And so our 4 phases of architecture have this, you know, this approach is something that we learned through the Tara project, and it's not totally dissimilar to what, you know, what the typical 4 phases are of pre-design, design, construction, and kind of post-occupancy assessment, which very often isn't done, and that's something that we're also pushing very hard to kind of re-articulate as part of our process. And what we really focused on, I think, you know, if you know anything about the hospital, you know, we were on site there for a year working with clinicians, working with doctors, working with the Ministry of Health during the pre-design phase, and that was kind of before we even got into the, you know, the depth of the design and construction document phase, but partially because it was such a complex program, and partially because if you're going to work in these kinds of areas, and I think we would argue that even here, if we were going to work in our healthcare industry, and we started to do a number of projects here in hospitals, you need to have a deep understanding of what the issues are in order to solve the problems and to identify those problems properly. And then finally, the idea for us is that having gone through all of these and kind of reworking how they must happen in order to have the maximum impact, our hope is that they generate system change, and that can happen in various ways. And we'll go through some of them in the rest of the talk. And then what we found was that when you do one thing successfully in a place like Rwanda, there's a ripple effect. The scale, the quality of the architecture there and the quality of the design was much appreciated by the Ministry of Health. And very quickly, there was an interest by donors, both from the government side in Rwanda, but also private donors through PIH, to build on the success of the hospital and expand the impact. And so these are doctors housing 4 doctors, both the kind of highest level doctors that are Rwandan who are living there. It's very hard to retain doctors in this area because it's so rural, and most people want to be living in the city. as well as exchange doctors from Brigham and Women's Hospitals and others who were coming to teach specialists, to kind of be specialization teachers and instructors there. And so the idea was a place of respite, something that was of a high quality, that was very comfortable, so that after a kind of fatiguing day of work, you can come and relax and have a place to unwind a little bit and recharge for your next day. And so we did this, these houses, and this is a little story about, do we have sound? It should come in a second, maybe it just doesn't come yet. Okay. This is just the story, again, as we're choosing materials, and that's, I think, what we'll get into next, is kind of looking very closely at how each and every material choice can have a very specific impact. This is the story
they call that really the same nickname.
I'm sorry to have to.
No, actually doesn't mention that.
Somebody had it.
Videos.
I'll let you restart.
This is the story of a woman who actually started working with me on the landscape first, and then started doing masonry. All right, let's see who we started. Is it on the desktop?
Yes, it is on the desktop.
If I open it and close it again, it should restart.
nta mugore wubaka nta mugore ugurira nta mugore ugize uramahaza igihe ariko no.
We used to have a popular drama on BBC. There is one woman working in the masonry. They call that really the same nickname.
Bakagaruka ariko iyo bumvise aho ngiye baza bavuga bati tukora kwa kamana.
She's working in the masonry, which is normally not common for a woman working in masonry. Now she's a team leader.
Ubwo nakomeza nkerereke umufungo. Ubwo bizamo gutyo bisa n'ibivamo karande. Kugeza ubu ngubu arishima ahagarariye ahangaha. Ndababwira impanga arishima. Aho tumaze kuba benshi. N'igitsina gore icyenda. Bose bari kuba mu gihe dukorera neza. No mu gihe dukorera gashya.
Around the village, she's changing the life of the colleagues. She's making other wedding in the village. She's now paying the school fees for the kid. She's helping the husband to build the house. She's changing totally the life.
Usibye ko gusa bumva iyo mbonye uko mbona nuko njye numva muka nanjye ubwanjye ubu aho maze kugera ngo natangiye agaciro ntabwo twagaha agaciro ntabwo twagaha agaciro kabwo mu buzima nuko tukayaba.
So this is just one of a number of stories that came from both Butara Hospital, and she actually kind of led the masonry for the Butara Housing, Butara Doctor Housing project, which we are now in the second phase and doing 5 more share houses, and she is again on site. And this is Dr. Agnes Beniguajo, and again, this is about a little bit the ripple effect of what a successful project can do and how it can have impact across a country or a region, and she is in the Ministry of Health. And Rwanda is held up throughout Africa as a place where their health care and healthcare services are absolutely amazing, and they're visited often by doctors from all neighboring countries to kind of understand what are they doing there that is working so well. And partially it's her and even the person before her openness to kind of try new things, to understand what's coming and how to prepare for it and anticipate and have the biggest impact they can on the day-to-day lives of all the people of Rwanda. This is an example of that, with an understanding that global cancer actually, 70% of the cancer cases are in resource-constrained countries. And if you know Africa, actually cancer has more cases than malaria, tuberculosis, and HIV combined at this point. And yet there are very few treatment centers in sub-Saharan Africa. There are only 15 machines that can actually diagnose for cancer. And so cancer and cancer treatment is really something that's up and coming in Africa. And so she initiated this cancer treatment center in Taro because of the success of the hospital in partnership with PIH. And so again, we used local labor and used a lot of the same, design ideas, natural, very, huge windows, as you can see, natural ventilation in these strips for even when these are closed, water collection on the roof, and to create an area for non-communicable disease treatment within Rwanda. Another challenge that we often give ourselves is, what if you use the most common building material and try to transform it in just one or two ways so that it's the least expensive that you can get, but maybe offer some ideas about how it can be used locally in a more interesting and more effective way than before. So this material on the roof is triplex, which is kind of 1/8 of an inch thick, really low quality plywood. And what could we do if we just hung it in a different way than typical, if we played with the colors, if we had our lighting integrated. And those are the kinds of material decisions that we try to make on all of our projects. And for this kind of design, we also are getting a lot of press, and that press isn't so much about what mass is doing, but the effect that architecture is having, and the idea that there could be transformative architecture that can also have a larger impact on our field. And again, engendering more and more interest in investing in these particular group of projects. And so the next phase is the Butaro Master Plan, as well as Agnes's personal project is a new medical university, which we're starting design on this summer and will be in the Brera area. One of the groups that work there, the Masons and the people in the wood shop, actually had come from another Partners in Health project in the east of the country. And once they had gained all this training on the hospital, they went back to Rinkwabu, which is where this other site is, and they opened their own cooperative and started bidding on projects. And when we were asked to do a neonatal intensive care unit on that site later, I think maybe a year after the hospital was completed, that cooperative bid and won and did a lot of the fabrication for this project. And so I think another story about what the impact of using local materials in the right way can have. And here, using again some of the same principles, natural lighting, natural ventilation, and creating the right kinds of workspaces for the clinicians there, and beautiful and kind of healing spaces for the patients. And so this is the kangaroo care ward. Kangaroo care is where mothers are skin to skin with their babies when they're premature or when they're low birth weight to keep their temperatures up, which is much healthier. And they have a massive success rate in terms of keeping children alive and healthy using this very, very simple technique. And this is that room, and then just some of the outdoor detailing, using local woods, local masonry, and also a very difficult site. The site that they gave us was about a 4.5 meter drop from the next building up, and yet we had to be able to access that because the newest ORs on the campus would be housed in this building, and so anyone getting an operation would have to come down into this building until the new ORs were built. So this is the sectional condition that we were dealing with. And so how could we kind of use landscape and local materials to make that a beautiful transition despite that. A lot of the steel workers were also the same steel workers in Rwanda, and then, you know, how can we utilize some of the local craft? These are Rwandan dung paintings, so they're usually use some kind of back surface, wood or other, and then they apply this beautiful kind of three-dimensional relief onto the surface and then paint that surface. And so these are integrated into all the patient care areas, and it's a very familiar kind of artwork that's present throughout Rwanda from the north to the south. And so looking at ways to integrate these kinds of things into the spaces. And in the meantime, training and having our senior architect, this is Commode, training, this is Amelie, who was one of the valedictorian of the first graduating class, and actually is now with us in Boston, and she did the construction administration. And, you know, really supporting her in terms of being a kind of female voice on this site. She led CA after the first 6 months, and it was a fantastic experience for her. And the output was amazing. And one of the things that we learned from her, and we try to garner this from everybody who's working on site, are, you know, what are the things that we can do to always create better outcomes? And one of her suggestions was, you know, every time we're starting in a new space with a new team, we need to explain to them what the space is for, what it's going to be used for in the end, what their part of the building is going to contribute to that. And it actually allows us to have a much higher level of quality because it creates instant investment on the part of the people who are doing that work. It's not just another job, but it's a job in a place, and especially if you're using, you know, labor that is from that town, this is a place that some of their family might eventually be going to. And it really changes the relationship of the people working on this project, and we all become part of the same team. And these are some of the future projects that are happening as we branch out from Rwanda, which was our first office, started in 2008-ish. And then from there, multiple projects in Rwanda. Now we're working in Uganda. DRC will show that project. Malawi, we're doing maternal waiting homes there. Zambia is a school. And then I'll talk a little bit about Liberia later, as well as Haiti. I think one of the things that is always talked about when we think about working in resource-constrained areas is the failures that we've seen happen before of NGOs who go in, whether they're governmental organizations or non-governmental organizations that build what they think is needed without necessarily understanding the site, understanding the context. And for us, this is a very simple example of that. Ciara Ranch Primary School is a project that we did. We're doing for African Wildlife Foundation, and they built this school. They purchased a huge tract of land to create a wildlife corridor between a very large park in the south of Tanzania and to connect it to Serengeti, which is in the north. And when they bought that, this school for Maasai, and it's a boarding school because the Maasai are migrating and move around from place to place. So they have a boarding school in this particular case. Was in the middle of this corridor, and so they were always being interrupted by elephants and lions, and it was really unsafe, and it was also not great for the wildlife. So they moved them to the edge, but it was an architect in the UK who actually did the design, and it was built for a flat site, and it was not a flat site. And so this project was only 6 years old when we saw it the first time. It has massive erosion problems. The floor slab is cracking and kind of moving away from, the porch slab is moving away from the main floor slab, which is also separating from the walls. It's a highly seismic area, as you'll see in a moment. So this is all, and also because it's hill condition, you have massive erosion problems across the entire site. To the point where, at the bottom of some steps, you're jumping off like 50 centimeters to get to the ground. And all these are very simple problems, but they create a condition for 900 students, which is less than ideal. This is the kitchen where they put in these fancy stoves that they didn't have gas for, so they're unused. They're continuing to use locally collected wood and made charcoal. The bathrooms are unused because they were flush toilets and they just don't have enough water for that. And finally, it's in a in addition to Rwanda, which is along this Albertine Rift, this is the second most seismic area in Africa. And Manyara Ranch is built right next to the most seismic area within this zone. And yet there was no seismic construction happening, so this is the area that we're talking about. So there are no columns in the buildings, and yet although there are ring beams, and so that was a big issue. So this is what you see all across the campus, and again, it's only 6 years old. The window frames, a lot of them were broken because they didn't open all the way, and they opened into like passageways, and so they would be hit all the time. So the question is, how can you prevent this kind of thing? And from our perspective, it's really about making the connection with the community and this immersion that you do in the front end to really understand the problems. And so our approach to another AWF school in Alima, in the middle of the Congo, it's quite far. It takes about 2 flights over 2 days. The flights aren't that long, but you have to stay overnight in each location, and then 6 hours on a motorcycle to get here. To bring in materials, it takes 3 months on a barge and then 1 day on a bicycle. And so it was very challenging, and this area, this school was being built for the community in order to kind of create future prospects for people there, so they would not have to rely on the local habitat of bonobo monkeys in the future, but could kind of generate other incomes rather than subsistence living in the habitat. And so the question was, how do we understand what's needed there and what's available locally to create a building, that is able to be maintained far into the future, so that materials don't have to be brought in that long distance, and potentially by upgrading slightly the materials that are used there, you can allow all of the other buildings that are built, all the residences, to have more durability through using new materials or slightly new technologies. This is the school that existed when we arrived. This is the other side of that. There were 2 sides on this open area. And one was open and one was kind of made of decaying earthen blocks. But there were amazing crafts there. It's some of the best woodworking and canery. It is the best woodworking and canery I've seen anywhere in Africa. And the blocks that they used were actually quite strong. And again, so the question was, how do we take what's there and just give slight improvements? We brought on, through the process, Jansi, Malela, and we tried to do SWALA projects, and Jonathan Bongi, who were both from Kinshasa. They were students that we met. We went to all the local universities in Kinshasa when we were there, and said, do you have any students who you think would be interested in doing an internship with us? This is the kind of work we do. And there was a lot of excitement, and so we hired these 2 guys from the 20 people who applied. And they lived with us on site for the entire length of the project, which was about a year. And you know, this kind of a project is all about logistics. We wanted to build this project 90% locally, 95% of local materials, which meant generating all the materials on site, from the foundation, through the walls, all the way up to the roof. And we really had to understand how that was going to happen without any special tools. And one way of doing this, I'm going to flip through it really quickly, is we really had to envision while we were in Rwanda, after having visited, we went in and we spent a week there and met with all the different groups and stakeholders and potential skilled workers to know exactly what were the steps that were going to have to happen, how were we going to get people up into the rafters to build this, and be able to prepare and plan for each and every step of the construction. And the design changed a little bit, but we didn't veer much from that approach. And this is how construction got started. You can see the kind of how reminiscent it is of what we predicted. But this is really the earthworks, and so one of the things that we did was look at the blocks themselves. They're using right now air-dried blocks. It's the technique that's found throughout that area. They had been doing some kiln-dried blocks maybe 20 years back, and you can see the remnants of that, but people at that moment did not know how to do that. And so the thought was, if we brought a lot of soil back with us, what are the options that we could use? And if we were to pick a particular option, what resources would be needed? And so what we found was, after doing numerous tests, that if we added palm oil, which is locally available, it could increase the durability of these blocks by a substantial amount. And that's something that people there could get and then could use on their own homes in future construction. In the end, we also built houses for the teachers, and we decided to try kiln dry blocks on the second phase of work, and brought in technicians to teach people there how to use kiln dry blocks, and so that also was an option. And then the next hurdle was the roof. Now that we have the walls down, how are we going to build the roof? And again, you could bring in tin, which is kind of the most obvious and desired material there. But it's very difficult to bring in over such a long distance. If they had to replace a piece or if something happened, it would be very difficult to get it in again. And also the quality of the material there that we found in Kinshasa was really low. And so it was inevitable that it would start to rust out within a few years. And so that kind of massive need for maintenance was something that we really didn't want to leave on the community as a burden. So we decided to go with local shingles, and again worked with Arab, trying to understand what the different, this is just looking at the different material potentials of the roof. So if we use metal, high import costs, low labor costs, and training potentials, low environmental sustainability, and really looking at each and every one of these, it would make this community rely on AWF to support this building far into the future. And we ended up going with hardwood shingles. We looked at all the different wood types to try to figure out which would be the best, and went with Bolongo. And then really on site, we did some tests in Kigali, and then figured out how to make shingles out of these massive trees that were right on site. And we also, again, these are now a material. We've left a huge bundle there for future maintenance, but also, can be used in the future on houses. They all know how to make the shingles, not they all, but a number of people in the community now know how to make the shingles. And so if there is the need for maintenance, it can be handled very locally. And I think this is also an approach to resilience that we think about a lot. If there is a catastrophe, how can that catastrophe be handled in a very local way without having to wait a period of time to bring in the materials from the outside? And the same thought process went into the roof structure. What were the costs, skills required, and what would be the benefits of doing it in particular ways. And this is an example. These are the amazing chairs that we saw. There were these as well as a variety of others with beautiful caning. And so we utilized that on the screen. So if we look at the plan, all the exterior walls have screens around the edge. Let's make sure this is the next one.
In Lima, Congo, one of the most remote places on the earth.
We left Kigali and we flew to Kinshasa via Alice, and then from Kinshasa we flew directly to Jogu.
So Jogu is the closest urban center, if you call it that. There's no power or no running water.
Then we hopped on some roads and we drove 5 hours on pretty bumpy roads to Lima.
The African Wildlife Foundation came to us to inspire those communities to build not just a school, but a place where they could convene, to preserve the wildlife that's around them. Here's a condition of incredible remoteness. What if you can't actually get any materials externally? What if the only materials you can use are those which are available right in your backyard?
In Lima, there's almost no outside source material. I mean, wood is being cut down from the trees next to the site, and the soil is being harvested on site. If you build something which is using all important materials, what happens when that tin eventually rusts out? When that steel is failing and that concrete falls apart? It will erode and it will turn into a ruin. Whereas usually we go to the lumber yard and pick out kiln-dried wood. For this project, a couple guys with axes spent half a day cutting it down. And it falls. Ron, our technician, cut it into 2 or 3 larger logs. Then guys with long manual saws will come in and all day essentially part that board up into pieces. And then they'll mark it for truss, column, rafter, beam. Working with the team here, we did a fair bit of research. Splitting shingles actually uses what's called a froe. When that piece of steel is driven into a log wedge, you then use the handle to leverage the fissure, the crack that's moving through the wood. The head mason, I asked him what his typical brick mix was. He mixed it all by foot. The sand and the clay we're taking from the termite mounds and mixing that all together. And the cohesion inside that mix actually becomes stronger.
That kind of, well, the knowledge doesn't come out of textbooks, it comes out of kind of engagement and asking the right questions.
De la population locale, ce qui les donne l'opportunité de pouvoir s'exprimer et de se faire connaître.
More often, what we see is capacity sharing, a kind of blending of ideas, and that's where innovation happens.
I have an idea. If you add polymer onto a brick, it's going to make it more resistant to water. Now, the guys on site have been adapting, finding new techniques. The building's growing up out of the ground in a way. As an architect, is kind of the most pure, exciting things you can do.
To make architecture something that every person can have access to.
An architecture that has a greater meaning in society and in our communities.
All the masons that I've talked to are like, yes, when I build a house, I'm going to use this design.
And that sense of ownership is the surest form of sustainability.
I would hope that if I go back to Lima in 10 or 15 years, I would see this school functioning in a way that we never imagined. That you would start to go to other villages close by and see some of the same curved walls, some of the same shingle roofs. We need to build more schools. There really needs to be a long-term investment in the communities in rural Congo.
And so these are just some, the school opened about 2 weeks ago, and we currently have the housing under implementation here. For teachers, the same issue, we have the doctors and all others. It's very hard to retain anybody in very, very rural areas. And so one thing that ABF is doing at all its sites is building housing for the teachers there to try to create a kind of longer, less turnover and a longer term commitment from teachers. So the latrines, and this is the school itself. And this is the opening. So this is the scale of the community. You know, for us, this is kind of the small scale of impact that you can have. If you do if we create a few minor changes in an approach to construction or a technique of fabrication, how can that improve lives on a daily basis? How can we infuse people or allow people to gain skills that can then provide future income for them that they would not have had before. Working in Liberia and also in Rwanda, we've started to work on policy level work. And so here, we actually went in and were there for 2 years, 2013 and 2014, and working on the healthcare guidelines for infrastructure. And we finished that in about December of 2014, which was just a few months before the cholera outbreak. And if you look at where cholera had an impact, it was the places that had the least amount of infrastructure, that had the very worst epidemic issues. And it was the places with the more intact, such as Nigeria and others, that had great or better infrastructure that were able to kind of trace and follow and shut the disease down as early as possible. And I think from our perspective, there's a lot of money that was pumped in during the kind of scare, especially as the United States started to be affected by Ebola. And one of the questions for us, and I think for everyone as we move forward, is how can some of the money that went there actually be used for longer-term infrastructure instead of short-term infrastructure. So this is an Ebola treatment unit. These are the ones by Medicine Without Borders, or Doctors Without Borders, and these were built all over the country, and each one costs about $5.5 million to build and run for 6 months, which is $1 million more than the hospital that we built in Rwanda. So the question is that really the best investment of funding there? And obviously, in kind of a time-sensitive situation, you don't have a lot of choices, and there isn't a lot that can be done, and so you do the best that you can. But our hope for Liberia going forward, and we were just there, we've been there twice in the past couple of months as things have been, as the Ebola outbreak has come to an end, and really trying to think about how we can begin to implement that infrastructural plan that we worked on with them. These are all of the sites that we visited throughout the country. We went to all the accessible sites that had health centers when we were there, and worked with those very, very local health centers, and created this massive book about and guideline for how the infrastructure implementation could go in the future, as well as a number of shovel-ready projects. Maybe they decided the lecture should end.
Fortunately, I think
Oh, there we go. Sorry. And so again, this is when, and we're doing, we want a tender to do the same in Rwanda, and so this is where you start to see success on the scale of a building, and gaining some kind of publicity for that success can translate into policy level and countrywide impact, so that going forward there can be a stronger infrastructure, a healthcare infrastructure that can help us to avoid some of the issues that are seen on a day-to-day basis. And now we'll just move to Haiti. This is another project that opened a couple of weeks ago. And again, looking at this idea of locally fabricated work and how that can be the most sustainable way to build and have the most impact throughout the project. And again, we're looking at infrastructure and how can we create, alternative methodologies for implementation in places that probably aren't going to get enough funds to do massive levels of infrastructure that we might be familiar with here. So in 2010, there was an earthquake in Haiti, and a lot of that infrastructure was torn apart, or there was of it. And as a result, cholera emerges as this massive outbreak. And over 8,000 people died in a very short period of time. But cholera is not something that is, it became very well known for this outbreak in Haiti, but cholera is something that's problematic all over the world, and has been growing as cities have been growing, and urban populations have been growing without, and in cities that don't have the infrastructure to support the numbers of people. In fact, 40% of the world's population has no access to some basic sanitation and infrastructure. And I think a lot of us are familiar with these examples: Brazil, India. There are countless. And our research, again, is about, especially in Haiti, the systems for dealing with this lack of infrastructure are also quite faulty. Especially when handling cholera, there were many, many examples and stories told about treatment from cholera treatment centers, or waste collected from cholera treatment centers that actually were not properly decontaminated and just dumped and then reinfected the water systems, which caused that cyclical pattern of infection. And the question was for us in this particular project is how can we break that cycle of recontamination and try to create a solution that perhaps wasn't a typical solution from our point of view, but could be something that could be implemented or replicated and have a much different effect. And so that was the kind of inception of the Cholera Treatment Center, which is, the idea is instead of a temporary center, which again we, in doing the research, found were very expensive to run. The tents have to be replaced every 6 months, and overall they don't contribute anything in the long term. So what if you built a structure, a very lightweight structure, hopefully as quickly as possible, that could be multi-use after the passing of particular epidemics, and actually contributed to something that could be a longer-term facility. So in this case, it's tailored very much to diarrheal disease. There's water collection. All of that water is used to clean all of the waste that is part of the product of a cholera treatment center. And all of that waste is filtered through a filtration system with a chlorine drip. And then in this particular case, we had to do a floating slab. The water table is only 1 meter below the surface. And so anything that you let percolate back down to that surface was going to go into the water sources for all of the neighboring areas. And so everything had to be treated. And so anything that was leaving this particular unit was 99.99% treated, and then it was allowed to then further infiltrate through kind of a green waste percolator, so that by the time it was into the groundwater, it was completely clean. And the idea here in construction was the same story as before. You know, how can we look at local craft? Haitians have fantastic metalwork that you'll hear a little bit more about, and how can we utilize that to create kind of the very bright and well-ventilated space for the cholera treatment center. And you know, the idea is if we can do one of these on this campus, which is next to Cité Soleil, which is a reclaimed surface from this bay that's next to Port-au-Prince. If you can have one of these, which is a pointal kind of infrastructure, what if you replicated them throughout this area? As well as the idea of it being not only a place of treatment, but it could also be a place for fresh water and treated water, because the group that we worked with there also gives out chlorine tablets, and possibly even sanitation. So all of these areas have public toilets that are in these massive blocks. What if all of that could be treated? And currently they're just cleaned out by people who go down and dig out all of that waste and then carry it to other locations. So this would be a way to also treat that. So that's that project. There was the last thing I wanted to tell you about with regard to that. Sorry, just a little bit more about this. So when we did the testing, we used kind of these smaller ventilation holes on the lower levels and larger on the upper, and that allowed kind of cross ventilation throughout the space. And then all of the training on this then was used on our next project for the tuberculosis hospital, and so we were able to use a lot of the same metal workers who had gained training here on that project, and they're also now starting businesses on their own. So again, I think the thing that is exciting to me and that I wanted to kind of share with you guys as students of architecture is the power of the design decisions that we make and how we make those decisions, and that each of those decisions, even something as simple as choosing a particular material, can have very big impact for the community. And I think that's the case, and we're looking at that, you know, whether it's in any of the kind of resource-limited places that we've worked, as well as, you know, starting to see how that has an impact in the United States and projects that we're starting to do here. So, thank you very much.